Hello and welcome to another video from the English at Penrice YouTube channel. Today we're going to be having a look at the character of Mr. Burling from J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls. If you're thinking about your exams, this is going to be particularly helpful for your English literature, Paper 2, Section A. Let's start by having a look at some key information about the character of Gerald. So Gerald is the archetypal upper-class Edwardian young gentleman. He is a member of the upper class. We know that because his mother and father are called Lord and Lady Croft. Like Mr. Burling, they own a very successful factory. Mr. Burling's very excited about the marriage between Gerald and Sheila because it means potentially the two business families working together for more profit. He's the archetypal charming, affluent man. He's described as the man about town, so very charming, very sociable, also rather sophisticated in his dress, perhaps. He is charming in terms of his relationships with the Burling family. He's very flattering during the engagement party, not only to his fiancée but also to the family. However, this charm soon breaks down when he, at the end of the first act, attempts to conceal his involvement with Eva Smith from the inspector. He tries to encourage Sheila to cover it up, to not reveal the part he's had to play in the chain of events. However, when he is interrogated, he does admit to being unfaithful to Sheila, to engaging in a relationship with Eva Smith, or Daisy Renton, as he knew her, to meeting her at the Palace Bar and taking her away from Alderman Meggerty and giving her dinner. He also confesses to providing Daisy Renton, as he thought her name was, with money and accommodation. So a friend, Charlie Brunswick, has some rooms that he's not using. So Gerald Croft allows Eva to, or insists on Eva, using the rooms as temporary accommodation. But ultimately, the kindness that we think he shows to Eva aside, he does ultimately end the relationship just before he goes away on business, leaving her again alone and jobless and quite desperate. At times, Gerald does appear to be emotionally moved and affected by the events that have been related by the inspector and about the recollections that he has of Eva. As a young gentleman, he does certain times in the play appear to have an appreciation of the need to be more thoughtful and the consequences of not being, especially for young, vulnerable women like Eva. However, because he is a member of the upper class, Priestley doesn't make this appreciation complete. Gerald does not appreciate his mistakes fully at the end of the play, and he fails to grasp the need for change, unlike Eric and Sheila. So he really is sharing Mr. and Mrs. Burling's view of the situation at the end of the play, that their reputation has been saved, that the situation is not a real one, and therefore they have been excused in terms of their immoral behaviour. This is unfortunate, really, because as a young gentleman, we would maybe, as an audience, want him to fully change and fully grasp the socialist teachings of the inspector. However, the reason perhaps that he is not fully transformed at the end of the play is that he's used as a construct by J.B. Priestley to represent the entitled, privileged upper classes of pre-war England. Perhaps he represents the idea that those richest in society were just simply unable to fully appreciate the struggles and the poverty of the working classes, and the need to be a lot more compassionate and a lot more thoughtful when entering into relationships with them. Let's have a look at some important quotes then that we can use to support our analysis of Gerald Croft when we're writing about him. So in the opening stage directions, he's described as the easy, well-bred young man about town. Now, in terms of well-bred, we're talking about Priestley suggesting that as a member of the upper class, he is well aware of the required manners and etiquette and address of people of his status of the Edwardian time. He's also described as a man about town, which suggests that he's rather sociable, maybe going out for drinks and socialising with lots of people of a potentially similar status to him in the town of Brumley. The second quote, "They'd be all broke if I know them," is a reference to the working class employees in Mr. Burling's factory, and he's talking about them not being very financially stable and having to return to work after a strike. In this case, he refers to them being financially broke, so with no money after the holidays. This shows a lack of understanding of the working classes, a lack of the suffering of those living in poverty. And then the third quote is a very flattering, charming comment that he makes to Sheila. "I hope I can make you as happy as you deserve to be." So, it's a very loving tone with which that's said. Unfortunately, and rather ironically, though, that's uttered because later on we discover that he has been unfaithful to his fiancée. And then, as mentioned earlier, this urgent tone in this fourth quote, "For God's sake, don't say anything to the inspector. We can keep it from him." So that suggests that he is not as charming and honest as we maybe first think about Gerald. Rather, he's trying to cover things up, trying to be rather underhand and duplicitous. So another word for two-faced. The irony as well is that the inspector is omniscient, so he knows everything. He's aware of everybody's involvement with Eva Smith, and Sheila knows this, and she laughs at him in response and calls him a fool. And then we have a rather patronising quote. Gerald is attempting to get Sheila to leave the room so that she doesn't have to hear the interrogation. He says to the inspector that Sheila's had a long, exciting and tiring day, almost as if you would be referring to a child at this point who's overtired and needing to go to bed. Maybe a hint that he wants to keep his immoral and thoughtless actions a secret from his wife-to-be, but also maybe a hint at his view of the female population, that they should be maybe spared distressing things. Then we move on to the quote that it makes up part of his interrogation. "I insisted on Daisy moving into those rooms and I made her take some money." So on the one hand, he does provide her with a place to stay and some financial support, some things that she desperately needs at the time. However, we do have these verbs insisted and made, which suggests that he's rather more forceful than we might initially appreciate. So he insists, so he stresses that she must move into his friends' rooms, and he makes her take money rather than offering the money. So there's an interesting suggestion there about Gerald perhaps being a bit more forceful and overbearing than perhaps we would appreciate initially. And then the penultimate quote, showing that he can be emotionally moved by the events and perhaps the recollections of Daisy. And he says, "I'm rather more upset by this business than I probably appear to be, and I'd like to be alone for a while." So the adjective upset shows that he's quite distressed and emotionally challenged by the situation, but also the punctuation mark showing that he's not able to easily articulate his feelings, and he's maybe feeling rather uncomfortable by the whole situation. That idea of liking to be alone, does suggest that maybe he wants to mull things over away from the Burling family. that maybe suggests to the audience that he will come back and fully appreciate the immorality and the thoughtlessness of his actions. However, at the end, he fails to do so, and unfortunately, for the audience, certainly, he sides with Mr. and Mrs. Burling, and takes the perspective that they've been saved from the shame of this interrogation becoming public and having to admit their failings on a more public forum. And Mrs. Burling tells Gerald, "You've argued this very cleverly," so that we as an audience get the impression that Gerald is very savvy. He is very clever. However, the idea of arguing it, so arguing their way out of blame and responsibility rather than fully appreciating and admitting their mistakes, is part of Gerald's character too. Finally, let's have a look at some sophisticated vocabulary you can use to enhance your analysis of Gerald's character. So as we've said previously, he's a sociable character. So he's able to converse quite easily with the more affluent of Brumley, as well as other charming other people too. He's rather charismatic, so he's very personable. People are attracted to his personality and his charm. He's very self-assured, so he's very self-confident, able to air his views and his opinions quite freely and quite confidently. And he's very privileged, so even more so perhaps than Sheila and Eric. He comes from a very rich upper-class family, has enjoyed a life of luxury, and hasn't had to struggle, we assume. As mentioned before, he's very charming and very gallant, or he appears to be at the start of the play, when he's very flattering to the Burling family, including his fiancée. However, he does appear to be rather intolerant when he talks about Mr. Burling's working class female employees, which suggests a lack of understanding of these people who really struggle in poverty and are at the lower end of the class hierarchy in Edwardian England. We can then say that he's duplicitous, which is a great word to use instead of two-faced when we're analysing his character, because not only does he cover up his affair with Daisy Renton, or Eva Smith as we know her, from his fiancée, he also tries to encourage Sheila to cover up his involvement from the inspector, to conceal it from him, which also suggests that he's rather dishonest. He can be quite patronising, in his description of Sheila as tired and she's had a long, exciting and tiring day. But he is rather astute, so he's rather clever, and he does go out and work out that the inspector is a hoax, much to the delight of Mr. and Mrs. Burling. And then finally, he can be seen as presumptuous, so he attempts to give the engagement ring back to Sheila, assuming that she will take it back, but unfortunately she's not ready to at the end of the play, which suggests that their relationship is also becoming more distant, perhaps. Okay, that was an exploration of the character of Gerald Croft from Priestley's and Inspector Calls. Sign up to the English at Penrice YouTube channel for lots more videos to support your English literature and language revision.